Tonight on This Week in Politics.
We are 75% completed, so you think the closer we get to the end, there might be more momentum to, hey, let's just finish this once and for all.
For years, the federal government has been holding back on funding the Lewis and Clark Regional Water System. In fact, this year, the White House initially set aside only $100,000 for the project. But there is a new development in the money fight tonight. Lewis and Clark Executive Director Troy Larson will be with us momentarily. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brian Allen. Speaking of money fights, another one is brewing right now involving the federal government and the city of Sioux Falls. At stake, the future of the city's public transportation system. We begin here tonight with Sioux Falls City Councilor Pat Starr.
As we continue to grow as a city, we're going to have more and more challenges because we get in that kind of spot where we don't qualify for certain programs from the federal government. So a lot of that responsibility falls back on us.
Sioux Falls City Councilor Pat Starr knows the clock is ticking when it comes to funding for Sioux Falls public transit system, Sioux Area Metro. And that ticking clock is counting down to the end of a good chunk of federal funding. SAM receives $2.6 million a year in federal funds. That accounts for 30% of its total budget. But once Sioux Falls hits a total population of 200,000, nearly all of that federal funding disappears. And factor in the changing ways of Washington, and Starr says he is nervous for SAM's future.
Most things in Washington are in flux all the time. I mean, I wouldn't bet the house or the farm on what's going to happen in the next couple of months as we change things around. The president just submitted a new budget for the next fiscal year, and we're seeing some changes in a number of programs, all the way from assisting people to farm programs to, transportation, and it's kind of turning into a year-by-year situation for us. So.
Starr says the common complaint he hears is that no one rides the public bus here in Sioux Falls, but he says that is not true. There were 796,000 rides just last year. Mornings and late afternoons are the busiest. But with a pending limitation in federal funds and continued growth on all sides of town, tough decisions will likely have to be made. Some already have.
We continue to grow outside of the city. We don't see the density that, as a city, we try to encourage as much as we can in the core and in those areas. And as you see that urban sprawl, where do you stop the service? We've already tried to limit the amount of service, how far out we'll go, so that you have to live inside the boundaries that we've established. And there is no plan to expand those boundaries, even as the city continues to grow.
While boundaries for ridership might not be expanding, that is not to say there aren't discussions about how to make Sioux Area Metro more efficient and relevant for those who may work but not necessarily live in Sioux Falls.
Do we need an express route to Brandon or an express route to Harrisburg, or do we need a drive and ride type of thing? Are we getting to that point where there's a parking lot somewhere and you go to one of the hospital groups, or you go to another large employer where they can concentrate, and there's some express things that you can do to take care of some of that?
This issue with public transit isn't the only growth issue on Pat Starr's mind. The city is continuing to struggle with available housing and affordable housing. And with city leaders saying new business recruitment is a priority, all of it becomes a round-robin scenario, mixing together new jobs, livable wages, and housing.
I'm convinced that the housing situation that we have, I try not to say problem, but it is a problem for a lot of people in our community, really goes back to wages and bringing jobs to town that pay living wages so people can afford to pay market rate for their housing. And my emphasis has really been on, if we're going to spend money as a city and invest in economic development and bringing businesses to town, they pay a living wage, and they're on the high end.
New apartment complexes are beginning to take up some of the slack, and Starr says permits for 1,000 new housing units for the Northeast Side have been approved by the city. But recruiting skilled workers continues to be a problem.
I've heard of a lot of construction projects and construction people who are not able to move forward because they just don't have the workforce.
Coming up next on This Week in Politics.
You're just dumbfounded, you're speechless.
After initially setting aside only $100,000 this year for the Lewis and Clark Regional Water System, the Trump administration may be on the verge of significantly increasing that amount. Lewis and Clark Executive Director Troy Larson, next on This Week in Politics from KSFY.